Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your microphones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Othmar Lehner. Dear Dr. Othmar Lehner is the director of the Hanken Centre of Accounting, Finance and Governance, associate professor of accounting at the Hanken School of Economics. Furthermore, he is a visiting full professor in finance at the Middlesex University London. Professor Lehner research interests are centered on the interaction of accounting and organization theory with a focus on ethics and sustainability, as well as on the use of artificial intelligence. Dr. Lehner also serves the committee as editor-in-chief of the Emerald Journal of Applied Accounting Research. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Othmar Lehner.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Hello, a warm welcome from the north. I'm about to share my screen, and so you should probably see my screen by now. Yep. Excellent. So welcome. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that is very dear to me, that is the sort of performativity of social and environmental accounting, and a little bit about the agenda. So over the next 45 to 60 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the introduction and potentially motivation, why this research might be important. Then I introduce the three leading concepts for my model, which is Barrett's Agential Realism, then Performativity as an organizational theory, and Blochian real utopias. And then we'll come to the model. I'll present also an example that illustrates the models, and then we continue to discussions and takeaways. And after that, I invite you all to raise questions or open a debate and discussion, and very happy to interact with you. So let's start with first positioning. What is social and environmental accounting? It is very different around the globe in terms of actual regulations and demands on companies, but basically, one of the core factors of here and social and environmental accounting here is understood as a political theory that comprises regulations, norms, and evaluative devices that are related to ESG impacts. One thing that research is sure that social and environmental accounting, from now on I will call it just SEA, has the potential to drive organizational change. One example would be because it demands and creates transparency, then the organizations can be held accountable for their environmental impact, for example. So that is something that is already given and researched in the literature. And furthermore, there's beautiful projects that I can sort of point out. The social accounting project that looks at what accounting can contribute to developing a future sustainable and equitable society. And also another stream of accounting research that is about accounting in the Anthropocene, in the time of mankind. And so researchers in the SEA sphere have also connected and looked at how can SEA promote a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness between organizations and the nature. What is some characteristics, or what are some characteristics of social and environmental accounting? Well, first of all, it's quite an interesting subject as well as context for this organizational inquiry. Why? Well, first of all, SEA comprises both. It has an outward-in perspective, like what does the environment or environmental change, think about climate change, what is the impact on the organizations? That would be a sort of a risk approach. And at the same time, it has an inward-out perspective, meaning the stakeholder approach, what are the impacts of the organization on the larger environment, on society, on its employees and all the stakeholders. So in that sense, it already transcends organizational boundaries. For example, many of the rules and regulations in SEA have a focus on the whole supply chain. The GHG, so the basically carbon gas emissions reporting in the scope 3, even demand that you follow up the use of your products in society and within other organizations. And of course, it demands a transparent public reporting. Now, the third, perhaps very salient characteristic of SEA is that its functional setup, its embeddedness and jargon, stems from financial accounting with a traditional focus on backward-looking information. But actually, its theological setup is political theory driven, with a focus on providing assured information about the potentialities for utopian societies. So that's a very interesting thing, that while the ideas behind that, so the theological setup is politically motivated, its functional setup stems from traditional accounting theory. And we see it now that even IFRS have now come up with new standards on social environmental accounting. We have global GRI standards, SASB standards. So there's lots of traditional, in a way, you follow a standard, but behind that, there's a very strong politically motivated theory. Now, how can we better understand causality between SEA and its performativity? Well, we need to bridge accounting and organizational theory. And the problem is obviously that current research on performativity may be ambitious, but it remains often ambiguous. For example, in the current organizational literature on performativity, there is an indifference between the theory performativity and the political theory performativity, which is, of course, misleading, because the political theory performativity brings with the necessary renegotiation of the ideology that is behind this theory. Now, the question, of course, may pop up: what is performativity? And we will introduce that very shortly. But one of the ideas of performativity is that, going back to Austin, that if you say something or communicate something, it creates something at the same time. Yeah, just imagine a traditional priest announcing someone: I now announce you as husband and wife. So by saying this, by this communicative act, something is created, something, an institution is basically translated into practice. And this is sort of the idea of performativity. And now we're talking about this communicative device of SEA, and how does that basically create something in organizations, but much more so in society. So, for example, what we don't see yet in the theory is the necessary reflexiveness. We don't look and we don't have theories about the co-evolving and reinforcing factors and the subject-object divisions of what is actually the observed and who are the observers in SEA are still not very clear. So we could also say that current theory performativity concepts, they lack a connection to ideology and to motivation. However, these are very necessary elements, right? So what do I want to do with my current ongoing research? It's not just a paper, it's a whole research that's going on there. So to gain a better understanding of this political theory performativity, that means a performativity that first begins within organizations, but because it changes organizational setups, organizational processes, and organizational habitus, it transcends organizational boundaries and has a societal implication, societal performativity. So in this research, I propose a recursive process model that is embedded in Barra's Agential Realism, which will be introduced shortly, and also includes ideological as well as temporal considerations based on Blochian's concrete utopias. There are three components that are necessary to understand before we can actually conceptualize and model this thing. The first one is that we need to look at Karen Barratt's Agential realism theory. Why? Because it brings with the terminology and the onto-epistemological toolkit to actually look at the social material underpinnings. Second, we need to revisit organizational theory on performativity, because there we find the conditions, or perhaps even missing conditions, and the non-linearity notions that will help us conceptualize the processes that transform organizations. And third, in order to understand inherent power relations, we need to clarify the ideological components. And for that, I will turn to Ernst Bloch and his concrete utopias. So these three key components I will briefly introduce before I use the knowledge and insights from these three components to model the political theory performativity of SEA. Here is a short visualization to see again my way of thinking. So we start with the foundational Agential realism that provides the onto epistemology. We look at organizational theory, what can we borrow from performativity notions there, and we use Bloch's concrete utopias notion to bring in aspects of ideology and of temporality. So let's have a look at the component one, Barratt's Agential realism. Agential realism is a post-structuralist theory. That means that we are looking to understand the relationships between the material and the discursive worlds, the worlds of talks, of communication. So while you could think like a book or a book of accounting is material, but the words in there, it's a communicative device. So it communicates something. So this relationship is very interesting to look at that. It is a feminist ideology, and that is very critical of traditional Western thoughts and looks for a more inclusive, equitable, and interconnected world, which is very helpful because automatically we have this idea of ideology included. It can be seen as a radical rethinking of performativity that looks more at the sort of situated nature of the concept and focuses on the interrelatedness and the contextuality. It differs a lot from other approaches because of its radical socio-materiality and the apparatus notion. Barratt proposes, and this is very interesting because Karen Barratt, just imagine that she has a doctorate and is a researcher in quantum physics as well as in sociology. So she brings in notions from quantum physics regarding that there is perhaps no otherness, no difference between observer and the observed. She brings that notion to sociology, to accounting, and so she says there is no otherness. Instead, there is an entanglement of forces and energy, which she calls intra-action. And in that is a very interesting thing that comes up, because knowledge is not an objective truth and can never be an objective truth, but it's an ongoing process of negotiation. And furthermore, human subjects she sees not as being distinct from the material world, but a large part of it in her apparatus notion. Now, an apparatus for Barratt is a form of politically boundary making based on entangled human and non-human agents, which shape the ways in which an agent can interact with the world. So we see human and non-human agents like nature, but also technology intertwined in an apparatus. And such an apparatus is a political device. And a Barrattian understanding of political sustainability, for example, would be about creating the conditions necessary for all life to thrive. This is a very, very interesting ideological motivation, and it comes out of this idea that there is no otherness between the humans and, let's say, nature. And if we think about that, then all of a sudden accounting that so far might look at nature in terms of cost factors, we see that this is simply wrong, because it's not us humans looking at nature and giving it a price. It is always humans and nature together that create the future, that create meaning, and we need to account for this meaning rather than for the cost of something external. What is very interesting, Bharat introduces agential cuts. That means that agents, so all those that are in this apparatus, produce cuts to temporarily construct boundaries and frames and produce knowledge through their interactions. And this is quite interesting to understand that basically, if we think about how boundaries, like what is the scope of our accounting devices, how boundaries limit us in terms of what we look at and how we sort of prepare our communicative accounts of that, then Bharat goes one step below that and says, well, how about we not just discuss permanently about what to measure within those boundaries, but look deeper in terms of, do we actually agree already on a set of boundaries? And she said, no, we never agree on a set of boundaries. We need to always leave it open for negotiation, because just think of a second, I do a lot of research and work also in impact investing, or with disadvantaged communities, like let's say people that live in a certain area and are disadvantaged because they're not industrialized as such. For them, their scope, their boundaries are very different, and then to, let's say, the banks that would do some investment activities into that. So it is quite important to understand that this step of Bharatian Agential realism, looking deeper into first negotiating and perhaps renegotiating the boundaries, is a very important step before we can even think about how we communicate the measurements for or within these boundaries. Yeah, and what might be very interesting to note is that Bharat is being taken up by accounting literature more and more to illuminate some of the current dilemmas that we inherently have in accounting, that is now confronted with these sort of notions of, well, traditional accounting concepts in practice might not work to actually transfer our organizations and our society to a more sustainable and equitable way of doing businesses. Second component, performativity. Now we come to this idea of organizational theory and performativity. Performativity does not stem from organizational theory. Yeah, performativity is this idea, it comes from a communication perspective and sociological perspective. Performativity is the idea that speech and other communicative acts do not just express the ideas and meanings, but also actively construct and shape identities, beliefs, and experiences. As said before, someone announces you as husband and wife, so it shapes, it constructs the notion of someone of a pair that lives together and stays together. If they have a child, it creates the notion of that being a family. And the same thing goes as well if someone communicates about their efforts in terms of climate, mitigating climate risks, then all of a sudden this company is seen in the eyes of the public as something different. And because it is seen as something different, its identity changes as well. Based on that, there's 5 major conceptualizations of performativity that we see in organizational theory. The original one, doing things with words, based on Austin, searching for efficiency. Lyotard, we see here a very strong postmodern influence. Constituting for the self. This goes back to the feminist researcher Judith Butler as well, where it's all about gender roles, gender identity. bring theory into being. This is very closely related to what we talk about. Calhoun, Mackenzie, for example. Just think for a second. Most of our economic approaches, most of our economics that we see now, basically is based upon a few theories. And these theories create the way we do economics, we do businesses. Just think about, there's very few more influential theories in economics than would be the Black-Scholes formula that allows us to calculate the pricing of an option. And that formula was, of course, derived from looking at how is the price calculated, but from this backward perspective, this theory was created. And now every issuer, every bank, or most of the financial institutions are using this Black-Scholes formula to set the prices. So by that, it becomes performative, because from now on, the truth, if there is any truth, the truth of what is this option worth is based on the theory of Black-Scholes model. And we would all agree that perhaps in 10 to 15 years from now, the Black-Scholes model might not be the right model anymore, because it does not account for the future volatility that we might see or something like that. Yeah, but for now, it's performing. So a few economic theories basically are not just meant to understand economics, but they're also changing how economics work. And so performativity is a radical traveling theory that is typically borrowed into and imported into other fields, such as accounting. Now, what is political theory performativity? I think for that, we would probably need to start by looking at what basically is political theory. Well, political theory brings with ideology and motivation to change. And is how it should be and how it can be explained. And now political theory performativity is the idea that these political theories can be enacted and performed, for example, through literature. Yeah. We all know, we all heard about how the power of books. Yeah. If literature talks about things in a certain way, then it creates that in society. About art, about social movements, and all other forms of political expression. Think about Fridays for Futures. Think about activists in the climate change sphere. And so this political theory performativity, the idea that theories can be enacted and performed, and by that, they not just describe, but they have a tangible present and shape and inform political decision-making. And there's lots of progress going on in the organizational theory. For example, Marty, Gond, Boden, Daderio, Garut, Gehman, Brissett. And of course, I missed many influential scholars on that. But there's also, besides this progress on what is performativity and how is the process going on, there's also a lot of unresolved issues in there as well. One idea, for example, is that performativity varies in terms of its effectivity and scope. While the generic performativity is always happening. Well, we can imagine in accounting that any calculative or evaluative accounting devices are always performative in a sense, because they produce certain effects. Yeah? If I rank my employees from best to worst, then of course that has an effect. It has an effect that, on the one hand, like the simply functionalistic idea of, well, someone might get fired and someone might get a raise, but it also creates an effect because by pronouncing that you are the best or you are the worst, it makes something, it does something to the identity of these people, of these employees. Yeah, the best employee might say, oh, wow, I'm the best, so now I can do anything, and even increase. And the worst one might say, oh, well, I'll probably get fired soon, so I don't do much anymore. So we see that a generic, a sort of small performativity is always given when we use accounting instrument. But let's go to this Bayesian or very strong or even political theory performativity, because then it's not so clear how does it work. So what needs to happen that based on using social and environmental accounting devices, inscriptions, how does that lead to a true organizational change? And a true organizational change would mean that in the next business idea, the ideas of SEA, of social and environment, are already there automatically, even without regulation, but they are there because it's in the mindset of people that we have to protect, we have to mitigate climate change. And we can't protect it, we can just mitigate it anyway. So it's very interesting in terms of effectivity and scope, and also what is very simply is abstract. I totally agree on that. It's very abstract, but it's very necessary to think about that. I told you about these boundaries before. So current approaches often overlook the fact that performativity is not like an intervention where you say, okay, we do something and then the outcome is change. No, it's not the case. It's basically much more an ongoing journey rather than a destination. So it can't be a fixed way or a linear way of thinking. And it's very reflexive between what, let's say, Hegel or Nietzsche as philosophers would bring with, it's very reflexive between the being and the becoming. And every being has a becoming in it, and every becoming has a being with it. Yeah. So it's very important to understand ontological and ideological perspective. And also the interaction between theory and practice, how does it provide room for renegotiation? If you think about, you have a rule, a regulation, and then you implement it in your organization. But by the implementation, you might find things are not overly clear. So you make up your own ideas about how should it be implemented, how should it be done. And perhaps you come up with brilliant ideas, and that again will influence theory, because that will become part of perhaps the next update of this regulation. So there's a two-way interaction. This creates a circle. And so this deeper understanding is missing in the literature on performativity in general, and on social and environmental accounting in particular. Component 3. Ideology. This is very interesting to understand and to see that we always talk about, hey, we want to have a more sustainable, more equitable society, but no one understands what that is. So it is an abstract utopia, something that we all wish for, something that we all might dream for. But if you put 5 people in a room and ask them about how exactly would it look like, it would differ wildly. Because there is no such thing as an abstract utopia. It's just some ideas and visions of the future, but that they are not in any way performative in a sense. And there's no wonder that it doesn't work, that SEA doesn't lead to this abstract utopia when no one even agrees on a utopia. So Ernst Bloch, he has another idea. He says a concrete utopia. A concrete utopia is basically, yes, we imagine a world that is better, but we do not think that we can create it in the now. Sorry, we do not think that we ever will reach that exactly, but we know that by working together, we can already set it in motion. We can already implement some economic systems already in the now that will lead to this next step that is necessary, not to this abstract utopia, but to the next steps on which we all commonly agree. And so it's basically a revolutionary practice, but an ethical one, that sort of constructs alternatives while fighting domination from any influence, and recursively bridges the future and the past. And with that, it brings with the dimensions of temporality, saying that the past, the present, and the future analysis can inform our aspirations. So learning from past mistakes, realizing its untapped potential. And this is very important for my model, because the model is a cyclical model, a recursive model that has inherent notions of temporality, that needs to learn from the past and act something in the present, and have an analysis of what will the future be in an anticipatory governance? So if you think about why and how is SEA and a concrete utopia related, we could say that SEE can embody such concrete utopias by inspiring concrete actions in the now already towards a more sustainable society. One example of that would be when we create a well-functioning mini-cosmos of diversity within an organization, with true diversity. Yeah, when old and young people, different cultures, different backgrounds in education, different gender. If we create this well-functioning mini-cosmos within an organization, it makes these utopian ideals of a diverse society even more tangible and accessible. And by that, it inspires a wider social and political change. So summing up, Bloch's ideas bring with the temporality notions as well as the ideology notions to SEA. And it does so by giving us a common vision and a participatory approach towards this common vision. Now let's combine these insights and model a political theory performativity. We take Barrett, we take performativity from organizational theory, we take Bloch as temporality and ideology in this figure that I showed you. So we need to understand that SEA needs to be seen as political apparatus. That's an entanglement of the actors and practices. We need to understand, and I think we all do by now, that SEA challenges existing accounting epistemes, because SEA has a focus on the ongoing negotiation between the material, discursive, and effective forces, and it's driven by ideology and motivation. So we already know that there's a challenge there. We just don't have the answer to this challenge. And the nature of reality itself, based on Agential realism and on this post-structuralist idea, the nature of what is sustainability, the nature of what needs to be done to mitigate, let's say, climate change, but also to improve the lives of indigenous people. This sort of nature of reality is constantly and needs constantly be redefined. Yeah. And redefinition is necessary because we learn by doing. Yeah, if you and as I said before, I did a lot of social entrepreneurship initiatives, and we work, for example, in Namibia and in other countries to sort of improve the lives of the people there. And when you come with your Western elitist ideas of what needs to be done, what needs to be financed, then you will sooner or later find out that actually what you do is complete bullshit, because you're ruining local traditions. You might be ruining the potential for them to grow by themselves. So with every intervention, we also learn something new. And if we do that intervention together with the people on the ground, with beneficiaries, then we learn by that. So the truth as such, or the nature of reality of what is right to do, is constantly redefining itself. So any model that does not have this recursive, cyclical approach of learning and acting, learning, rethinking, and sort of, again, starting the whole process would be wrong. So based on what I said so far, I create a cyclical model that moves through the phases of political legitimization, anticipatory governance, materialization, and realization. And then it starts from the beginning. Like in music, we would say da capo, and hopefully no fine. Yeah. So this would be the model. And if we look at, it doesn't matter where you start, because basically we can never say, okay, now we're new, let's start there. But let's start with the idea to first create and learn something from the past. And what we've learned from the past needs to be politically legitimized, meaning that, hey, that what we learned is actually agreed upon. And by that, for example, in organizations, we can internalize the external social and environmental accountability. So we can accept, we've learned that organizations are and need to be held accountable for their social and environmental impacts. We move to the anticipatory governance. So learning from the past, we also need to take the past and create robust action strategies. By mobilizing heterogeneous actors, I will later talk about that, but any action strategy that goes back also to Ferraro, for example, in his AMR paper, any action strategies that is not sort of including different actors from different organizations and different setups will fail because it's just our own idea of what we do. Then we materialize that and create the prefiguration in the present, meaning we make it happen. We put these actions into practice, and then we realize it in the future. So these actions have happened. We have created new knowledge, and now we need to understand it as a community. What have we just learned from these actions? What is the outcome? Was the outcome the desired outcome? And where do we go from here? And this realization, again, what we've learned, we will learn a lot, but not all of that knowledge will be instrumental, will be commonly agreed. Some of that might be simply based on single actors or single ideas. But there's lots of knowledge that will probably lead to a broader canon, to a broader political legitimization, that we say, okay, that is really a takeaway, how we should do it. And that will be put, for example, in regulations again, and will be put into the next cycle here. And as I said before, it's an abstract concept, but to illustrate this abstract concept, I will now bring an example on the case of the TCFD. And so the TCFD is, well, it's short for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is basically dealing with climate risks and scenario techniques, how you need to report climate risks and climate impacts. And the first step in our model, the political legitimization, let's look at that, for example. One thing that is required by the TCFD is to set up scenarios based on a set of commonly agreed principles. So meaning the scenario, you can't just say, okay, we think this is going to happen and this is going to happen. We would all agree such a scenario planning would not work, but we would say, okay, we set up a scenario based on a common agreement. For example, a science-based targets, where we would say, what would happen if we stay within the 1.5 degrees increase of an average temperature? Or what would happen if we are even higher than 2 degrees? Yeah? So these science-based targets are available. They are a supranational platform. It's a collaboration between the CDP, the United Nations, and the World Wide Fund for Nations, and many, many companies. And because these are agreed and commonly agreed, this platform has political legitimacy, is so-called a knowledge that is accepted by a broader and very broad range, and is sort of valuable to go into this cycle. Based on these scenarios, because we see that it's legitimized, based on these scenarios, we then have to look at what it means for our organization. So we need to govern this holistically with the support of all major stakeholders. If we just ask our CEO what she thinks about what will happen if that scenario comes into place, then, well, that's just one interpretation. But if we ask all major stakeholders, what will happen if that scenario comes into place, we can actually anticipate the future. So that's the second step of an anticipatory governance. Now we have the scenario, we know what will happen based on this scenario. So the next thing is, well, we need to act on that. We need to create action strategies. We need to, for example, in the climate idea, we need to create strategies that would mitigate the identified risks. And of course, with any strategies, we need, and actions, we need to have goals and targets. And so we need to set that. This is kind of prefiguration that we would have. And these actions will mobilize other organizations as well. Just think about if one of the actions would be you want to change to zero carbon energy and resource suppliers. What that means is some people will go out of business, some organizations will go out of business, and you will make business with other organizations, with other companies. So by that, you mobilize other organizations, some detrimental and some beneficial, of course. So this action actually leads to materialization of the previous governance and prefiguration. It means, hey, we actually see what's happening. If you do not supply carbon or zero carbon resources, what will happen is you go out of business. And what will also happen is because I have suppliers that are zero carbon based, all of a sudden other people want to buy from me because they also have this strategy. Look at the scope 1, 2, and 3 in that thing. And so because I do that, they can now buy from me. So it mobilizes other organization and leads to materialization. And this materialization has an impact on the world. Well, not just because we have created a report and all the other organizations that were involved have created a report that everyone can read. So these reports are read by some. And this realization, okay, hey, there's a causal chain between climate, the risks, and the actions. And so this causal chain that was materialized before based on the governance, based on the political legitimization that actually this is something important, this scenario might happen, this knowledge is reflected in society. And of course, reflexively adjusted within the organization. So not all the actions will be super cool. So there will be an adjustment as well. So we have reflection and reflexivity together. That's recursiveness. And we are at the end of this one cycle. And so now Agential cuts, going back to Bharat. So basically thinking about what are the boundaries, what is important, what is not. So they separate. These Agential cuts will then separate which of this knowledge that has now been created is legitimized and needs and will go in the next round of the cycle, and which one is not legitimized and is basically phased out or not valued. So I wanted to illustrate this model on this example of SEA TCFD, why and how SEA will not just have, I will go back here, will not just have a performativity on the organizations, but can and will have a performativity on society, on the larger society, in terms of influencing rules. And as we learned previously on the on what a political theory is, will also have an impact on how decision makers and regulators will create and further develop regulation. Okay. So come to the final point, discussions and contributions. And of course, in my research and my paper that will sometimes be sort of published, we have a lot of discussions and contributions in there and go deeper. But I wanted to point out some of the things. The first one is this: why is the onto-epistemology so necessary, and why is Bharat so important? And I think if we understand, and the model shows that theory performativity is a social material process that involves the whole apparatus. So we look on all the stakeholders, for example, stakeholders together with nature, regulators. So they all form an apparatus. And in this apparatus, there happens a constant recursive renegotiation of political theory. We also learned, and we also see that SEA knowledge that is created is always only partial and situated. Yeah, meaning that knowledge that is now just created, is just valid in this one moment, and will be redefined in the next cycle immediately. But this is good, because by that we learn, by that we develop, by that we become. And where do we want to become to? Well, to a utopia that's actually a more sustainable and equitable society. And the importance that we also saw in here, and this is also a very ontological aspect, is that knowledge making in the governance must be a participatory process. As I said before, if we leave out all the stakeholders in looking at what would be the impact of a certain scenario, we would not come to a true and fair knowledge. We would come to just single-sided, silo-based insights. So I just talked to Paolo Quattrone yesterday, and he said something very interesting. So he sees that he's not talking about SEA in specific, but on the common good, which is very closely related to SE as a political theory that wants to create the common good. But he said that common good needs to remain a mystery rather than being prematurely institutionalized. It needs to be able to constantly redefine itself by negotiation and legitimization to strive for concrete utopias. So here is this political theory in flux that basically looks at there is no one single SEA political theory, but so we cannot ever say this is the one that needs to be performative, but we can say that the performativity process includes the redefinition of the political theory by the process of legitimization, of participatory knowledge creation, and by constant renegotiation. And here I created an overview of some of the ontology and epistemology items, but what we need to know: ontology, what is real, what can we rely on? Epistemology is basically how can we learn something from that? And if we think about that, for example, here, one of the ontological aspects that we brought with is nature has agency. And that means that if we do not look at the interdependence of natural systems, but just look at let's think about agriculture production, in which we just think about what is the farming output. This is wrong. Every insight that we may get from farming outputs is wrong, because nature has agency, nature is embedded in that. And if we think about biodiversity, it means that we need to not just measure the individual farming output, but also at the same time look at what is the input and the impact of this farming on the broader ecosystem, on the broader biodiversity. Yeah? Because without biodiversity, perhaps farming would not be possible in the near future, because if there's no bees, then there's no flowers. If there's no flower, you know, all this sort of concept. Yeah? So this epistemology is very important to understand. What do we measure? How can we learn about the things? Or here that we say that knowledge is just always partial and situated. So what it means if we do research and we do a cross-sectional research, like what is the current SEA status in this and that, it is meaningless. It's meaningless because research on SEA, because it's always partial and situated, needs to be longitudinal. It needs to understand the dynamic, the processes in it, rather than looking at a single point in time and say, yeah, current GRI standard, that is SEA. No, it's not. It's just partial and situated in this very moment, and it's actually in flux. So we don't learn nothing by looking just at one moment. And already at the summing up, and so basically this research that I do, this modeling, presents SEA as a powerful social material, inherently political intervention that is capable of creating and shaping organizations and society. It proposes a recursive model to understand the dynamics, how it's happening. This model overcomes, and all the organizational theory scholars would know what I'm talking about. It intends to overcome the staticness of institutional and actor-centric views. And furthermore, it looks at the nature of political theory performativity in itself and tries to include ideology in its conceptualization. It connects with the Anthropocene and social accounting project streams of research that we have. It corroborates the claim that accounting can pursue the goals of sustainable and equitable societal development. It advocates for an onto-epistemology for SEA that goes beyond traditional accounting subjects and objects. It actually transcends their division. There is no subject and object division. There is just an entanglement which we can look at. from inside. And furthermore, it stresses the importance of understanding the social and political dimension of accounting overall, because it has much more than just simple effects. It has societal impacts. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was interesting, and I'm very, very open and happy for all questions you might have and discussions and debates.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Lehner, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Anyone have any questions? You can open your mic and ask your question. Rawad, do you have any question? Dinova?
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Greetings from Portugal.
Much more sun there, right?
I wish.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks for this presentation. as I was listening to it, I was traveling between two different topics. The one that you've covered and another one that I've been thinking about, which is about the implementation of beyond budgeting.
Yeah.
So one case that we've been studying is an incomplete implementation of beyond budgeting. So it doesn't really follow what is prescribed in the normal recommendations. And I was thinking about to what extent this, and I'm sorry for not exactly articulating well my thoughts, but I'm just trying to make the best I can on the fly. So these people realize that they wouldn't be able to implement beyond budgeting in the textbook way. And they have made an incomplete implementation of beyond budgeting. So they were producing those impacts within the organization, that particular organization. And okay, it's not easy for me to organize my ideas, but my thing is, as researchers, as we document and explain and try to make sense of that, we are probably engaged in some kind of performativity as we spell out the rationale of these people. And to what extent can we be considered one of these agents carrying out these ongoing adjustments based on experiential learning? So this is not really a question, but a way to elaborate on all the things that you've communicated with us. So sorry for not exactly being a question or comment. But...
No, but it's a very relevant comment, and thank you so much. It's called Lenovo, but it's probably not your name.
Right? I'm so sorry. I'll fix that.
Yeah, but so anyway, thank you so much for raising that. What it shows is that actually what I in my contributions and discussion said that we're looking at SEA, at the social and environmental accounting, and look at the theory performativity in there. But what we've learned is a process that is valid for all sorts of theory that is sort of created and co-created. So I think the context as you presented of beyond budgeting is certainly the same model would be applicable for that. So I don't think the model is very specific to SEA. In any phenomenon that is driven by, let's say, ideological or political motivation, and beyond budgeting is such a thing because it has inherently this relativeness to others in there, then yes, I totally agree, the researcher is part of this apparatus. And if you think back on Karen Barrett and her quantum physics, she goes back to Niels Bohr, where she said that if you look at any quantum phenomenon, and you probably know that if you measure something, a quantum phenomenon, then this measurement influences the outcome. And that's exactly what we as researchers are doing. And I think what is one of the implications of that is that if we as researchers know that this is the case, that we are actually having a strong impact as part of this apparatus on the measurement, then we also need to be careful and can be held accountable for what we're doing.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you don't have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Awad? Yeah, you can ask. Awad, you can hear me?
Probably not.
Yeah. There's another question. If you don't have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Daniela?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I don't have any questions, but it was a really interesting topic. I really liked listening to it. I like this connection between, you know, this new dimension on accounting. We are doing research on accounting on our own. We are looking at sustainability reporting and looking at it in a different way and thinking about it, especially in the long term, is a valuable insight that is something that I really keep in mind, because it makes sense in so many, you know, it's a process and so many things are changing right now. So I really like listening to it. It was many good insights that I got to know out of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Thank you so much. Kind of you.
Another question? Kevin?
May I?
Yeah.
Just a question on you mentioned that you have an ongoing paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any work in progress versions available somewhere?
Unfortunately not, because it's in peer review, so it's
okay. Just wondering if there was a version presented at the conference somewhere, or
yeah,
okay.
no, unfortunately.
We'll have to wait.
No, yeah. But thank you so much for the interest. It's, you know, it's rare that someone actually reads our papers, you know.
There's another question. I think out. Your mic is working now, or you can write your question into the chat if your mic doesn't work. If you don't have any questions,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think I have a problem.
I can hear. I can't hear. Yeah, now.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
You know, bridging those different systems is always a
Yeah.
tricky thing, right?
Yeah.
Bringing it into Zoom, out of Zoom, and yeah, I know those things. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'm also very happy if you connect with me and send me an email. You find me on the internet easy, Othmar, Lehner, and just Hanken or Helsinki. You will find me. Happy to stay connected with all of you. Thank you again for listening. Thank you, Mohammed. It's a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to this talk. And well, then I wish all the best to you from my side.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Lehner, for your contribution and your effort. Thank you very much. It is an excellent presentation. Thank you everyone joined us today, and thank you very much, dear Professor Lehner, for taking time out to us. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
Thank you so much. Or as we say in Finland, kiitos paljon. All the best. Bye.
Bye.